So now I think we're ready to talk about modern psychological perspectives. Each of these perspectives offers kind of a different picture of why people behave as they do. So neither perspective is right or wrong necessarily, but each perspective is useful in kind of its own way. So for example, biological psychology or behavioral neuroscience tends to focus on relationships between the mind and behavior and underlying biological and chemical processes. This will include genetics, biochemistry, anatomy, etc. And plenty of advances from the early 70s, especially methods for observing brain activity, make this possible. So this has really led to an explosion in knowledge about connections between brain and behavior. That would be biological psychology. Evolutionary psychology, which is related, of course, focuses on how our physical structure and behavior were shaped by their contributions to our species' survival. So current behavior exists in its present form simply because it provided some advantage for us in terms of survival and reproduction for our ancestors. So for example, an evolutionary psychologist might be interested in the fact that we've got really good memory for faces, and especially for faces of people who have cheated us in the past. Perhaps it was really useful in our evolutionary environment, in our ancestors' environment, to be able to remember people who have done them harm in the past so that perhaps they're not done harm again. And in fact, they could even let other people that they know, family members and so forth, to steer clear of that person that did them harm. Cognitive psychology tends to focus on the process of thinking or processing information. And because our ability to remember is important in processing information, as a cognitive psychologist might have a lot to say about the storage and retrieval of memories. A developmental psychologist explores the normal changes in behavior that occur across the lifespan. So they might look at something, if we were interested in pursuing memory, that looks at how memory functions as people age. Sociocultural or social psychology describes the effects of the social environment, including culture, on people's behavior. One can't fully understand a person's behavior without understanding their culture, their gender identity, their ethnic identity, all of these components. And recognizing individual differences is especially important to psychologists interested in personality. So going with additional perspectives here, psychologists who adopt a humanistic perspective explain human behavior as stemming from your choices and free will. And these choices are influenced by your self-concept, basically how you think about yourself and your self-esteem, how you feel about yourself. A growing emphasis on these kinds of things like human strengths and how humans attain happiness and so forth have led to a subfield called positive psychology, which is led by Martin Seligman and Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. Seligman at University of Pennsylvania and Csikszentmihalyi at an institution in California, Graduate School of Management of some kind. I can't remember the exact name. So most psychologists take a very eclectic approach. That is, they sort of look at things from multiple perspectives. And so imagine they were interested in explaining anxiety. A biological approach might look at anxiety as related to chemicals or genetics in the body, right? So hereditary types of approaches. An evolutionary perspective might be, hey, anxiety has been adaptive for us. It's been useful for us in our previous environments. It's helped humans survive because it warns them about danger and so forth. But maybe in modern times, the dangers are different, and we don't need that much anxiety anymore. What was useful to us in one environment is no longer useful to us. Psychodynamic approach might be, hey, anxiety could be produced by some unresolved feelings of hostility or guilt or something of that sort. A behavioral approach would be that anxiety has a learned component, so that it's a response associated with a specific stimulus. Then maybe that stimulus or that response actually has been rewarded in the past. The social approach is that anxiety is a product of culture. So for example, in the US, more women than men report anxiety. And that may have something to do with their socialization. In fact, men are often raised to believe they should not be afraid. In fact, they must not be afraid. So that might have something to do with it. A humanistic approach would be anxiety is rooted in people's dissatisfaction with their current self or their situation. And cognitive approach might be anxiety refers to the idea that people think differently than non-anxious people. So maybe one ways of fixing anxiety is to point out where people are sort of thinking wrong, thinking in ways that are not particularly helpful, and work to improve people's thinking or changing thinking to something that's more rational. So the eclectic approach is that, hey, this anxiety tends to stem for all kinds of things, and there's all kinds of ways to potentially fix that anxiety.